Before meeting LaTanya, I had never in my life encountered anybody who cheated death.
I'm in the closet, I'm frozen in the closet and holding my sister's back. Next thing I know, I hear gunshots.
People are really willing to go to great lengths to get revenge when they feel like they've been wronged.
It had got to a point to where this was a different person. And how do I get out of this safely?
Once he realized he was losing control, he lost it. And maybe something in him did snap.
On the night of April 9th, 2014, a woman calls Wake County, North Carolina 911. She says her name is LaTanya. She has a restraining order against her estranged husband. He's there now. Then the line goes dead.
A situation like this, domestic violence call, typically we respond with multiple units just due to the unknown nature of what the call is about, if there's any weapons involved, anything of that nature. As we were responding to the call, it got upgraded. Additional 911 call came in from Jeremy, the son of LaTanya, and he had stated that his grandparents had been shot.
15-year-old Jeremy says he's hiding in the closet with his two 8-year-old sisters.
Told them, yelling on the phone, that somebody's dead here.
At that point, we expedited our response. Several other units checked en route to respond.
They don't know where the shooter is, and yet there are these children in the house with their mother that really need help. And so it's a very tense situation.
Responding deputies breach the home. The shooter has fled. At least 3 kids should be inside. Have they been shot too? Authorities find the children unharmed.
They get the kids out, which was their first priority, to get those kids to safety. And they find LaTanya, and they believe she's dead. She's unresponsive, bloody on the floor. And then she gasps. And the medical workers who were there, the EMTs, are like, we've got a shot at saving this woman.
LaTanya Allen was one of 4 children born to devout Baptists Angelia and Sylvester Taylor.
My mother was the pastor of Zion Hill Holiness Church, and that was located in Jonesville, North Carolina. And it was a small, little small community family church. You know, my dad would help serve. He would cut the grass for the elderly ladies and widows.
Deacon Taylor was a father figure. They were like spiritual parents to all the members of the church.
I have 2 brothers and 1 sister, and I'm the baby of the family. My family was very religious, and I wasn't allowed to date.
That didn't stop LaTanya from befriending a soft-spoken guy named Nathan Holden.
Nathan lived in the same community that our church was in, and so he would come and visit our church. He was a guy like you could just talk to about anything. You know, he would talk about girls and I would talk about guys, and we were just always laughing and having a good time. So he was just like my best friend, you know, growing up in high school.
Their friendship eventually grew into young love. But when LaTanya was 15, things took a more serious turn.
I would say we were high school sweethearts. It became sexual, and I got pregnant the very first time. I was afraid to tell my parents because my mom was the pastor. And so it was a lot of shame attached to that for me. I felt like I let my parents down, like I felt like I failed them. I felt like my dreams were lost.
LaTanya worried her devout parents would be angry, but they chose a loving path.
They just reassured me, they just loved on me, encouraged me, and, were very supportive of me. I was surprised that my parents responded the way that they did. My dad was he was very upset in the beginning, but he tried not to show it to me. He didn't want me to give up on, going to college and doing the things that I wanted to do.
Unfortunately, Nathan wasn't as supportive. When he first learned LaTanya was pregnant, he denied the child was his.
I get it. We were young. I was 15, 16, and that fear, that comes with that responsibility and just accepting it.
Shortly after Jeremy's birth, a paternity test changed Nathan's mind.
Once Nathan found out that, Jeremy was his baby, he stepped up and began to support us, financially and help raise Jeremy with me, while I finished school, while he finished school. I knew Nathan was raised, not in the best situation. So Nathan was very adamant about us raising Jeremy together because he didn't want to go through, some of the things that he saw his parents go through. We decided to get married my second year in college. So we wanted to do the right thing and make it official. And so that was a very big step for us.
Mom Angie officiated the wedding, and my dad, of course, walked her down the aisle and everything.
For the first few years of their marriage, everything seemed to be wonderful.
My son was 6 years old when my daughter was born. So I had my boy and my girl, and it was perfect. But a few months later, I'm pregnant again. So I'm pregnant back to back. Again, I'm going through the postpartum depression. It kind of drew us apart. And I know Nathan probably didn't know how to handle, the situation, but a lot of times I tried to mask it. I tried to act like things were okay when it wasn't okay. Once the kids, started kindergarten, I returned back to work. I'm excited, it was like I'm finally getting out of the house and getting that independence and, getting back in the workforce. And I was excited about that. But I could tell that the dynamics of our relationship started to shift in a negative way because we found ourselves kind of going our separate ways.
LaTanya and Nathan separated in December 2013.
When I decided to move out of the home and move in with my parents, I sat the kids down and let them know, this is my plan. My son was happy, and the girls, of course, we going to grandmother's house, so they were excited.
But 4 months later, their world explodes in violence.
Initially, Deputy Broadwell and Deputy Shapcott were the first two to arrive on scene. Once I arrived on scene, I noticed Deputy Broadwell running outside with 3 children. They were obviously hysterical. They were traumatized by what had just happened.
EMTs worked to stabilize LaTanya for transport. Jeremy had told the 911 operator his grandparents had been shot. Deputies search for the couple.
And then they find their grandmother dead in one room.
As the other deputies continued to search the area, they located LaTonya's father. He was deceased in the backyard. They attempted to provide aid, but he was beyond life-saving measures at that point.
Both Sylvester and Angelia Taylor are pronounced dead at the scene.
The kids are now in the car with one of the deputies, and now the crisis becomes getting LaTonya to the hospital. And then the next crisis is, who did this and how do we find them?
As doctors try to save LaTonya Allen's life, Wake County, North Carolina Sheriff's deputies comfort her children and try to find out what happened.
At that point, the kids weren't sure whether their mother was deceased at that point or if she was alive. They said, "Don't leave us." And I said, I promise you I'm gonna stay here with you the whole time. I asked all three of them, I said, "Who did this?"
I was scared at first because I thought he was gonna come after me or my sisters, on telling. I was trying to be protective at first.
The terrified boy doesn't want anyone else to die, but the detective reassures him that they're safe now.
A little while after a while, they asked me again. I told them who it was.
He said, "It was my dad." They said, "Don't call the police. He's gonna come back and kill us." They were in such a state of shock that they didn't even realize we were the police.
Jeremy says the nightmare began earlier that evening. He was staying with his father while his parents worked out a custody arrangement. But around 8 p.m., his father got up to leave.
I asked him, "Where's you going?" He said he was going up the street somewhere. So I told him, "Let me go with you." He was like, "Okay, come on." So, got in the truck. It was about to get dark. While we was driving, he stopped on the curb, and he got out, went into the woods and got a bag. So he put the bag between his legs. So I'm sitting there, what's the bag? He didn't say nothing, kept on driving. His demeanor the whole time we was driving, he was just, relaxed, he didn't really say nothing much. He had the music on. And after that, we went to Zion Hill Church, which was my grandmother's church. Pulled up to the churchyard, and he told me to get out and see if mother's in there.
On Wednesday night, we usually have Bible study. I remember Jeremy coming in the door asking, was his mom there? He spoke to his grandmother, which was Pastor Taylor, and she said, "No, your mom's at home. She was not feeling well."
Jeremy says that when he told his father where his mother was, his dad's mood suddenly changed.
He had a real serious face, his eyes locked on a target like, he's on a mission. He looked like he was on a mission that night.
Nathan took Jeremy to get food before going to the house. By the time they got there, Jeremy's grandmother had returned home from church. His grandfather and mom were there.
I saw my grandfather come to the door. Went into the bedroom, talked to my mother. She asked me, what are you doing here? And I said, I don't know, my dad wants to see you. Moments later, I hear gunshots. I hear yelling, screaming. There's a lot of yelling and shooting at the same time. So I hear running through the house. My mom is telling me and my sister to go in the closet. Then she called 911. I hear some more gunshots.
That's when their father came in the room.
Frozen in the closet and holding my sister's back. Next thing I know, I hear smacking and punching. My mom is saying, I'm sorry. She just saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I hear a lot of smacking. I hear more gunshots. There's a dead silence. I couldn't move. I was just, shocked, frozen, everything. I didn't know what to do. I was just scared. And then I heard knocking at the door. It was my father. My sisters came behind me. My father tried to give them a hug, but they wasn't with it. I saw my mother lying dead in the hallway. After that, after he gave me a hug, he said he loved us, and then he just left.
Deputies get a description of Nathan's truck from Jeremy and immediately put out an APB. Within minutes, they find the truck at a rural property a few miles away. But Nathan is already gone.
So now they have a suspect, but they have to find him. This land, this property, is 42 acres. It's pitch dark. There's no lights on this property. So it's a needle in a haystack. But they also know he is a very, very dangerous man. And they don't know where he is.
As authorities in Wendell, North Carolina continue their hunt for Nathan Holden, his estranged wife, LaTanya Allen, is fighting for her life.
So when I got to the hospital, Tanya was under heavy security. She was actually still in surgery also. But they had her in there under an alias, which is protocol, and what they do when there's domestic violence and situations like that arise. There's a lot of family, friends, church family, all were there at the hospital, to support Tanya, of course, and all of us. The kids at that point were in protective custody.
Well, everybody was getting bits and pieces, so we didn't really know what was happening, what to expect. We couldn't go up, so we all just kind of just sat around and was just in a state of shock and praying that Tanya pulls through.
He shot her in her face from the side, basically through her mouth, through her jaw, broke her jaw, knocked her teeth out. So she had to have multiple surgeries.
LaTanya's teeth deflected the bullet, preventing it from entering her brain. The more life-threatening wound is in her chest. Doctors worry they might not be able to save her.
At this point, LaTanya Allen's family is planning for 3 funerals. They have pretty much figured that she is not going to survive. It doesn't look good. And so they're in this state of just shock and disbelief. They've lost their parents, and now they have these 3 children that need to be cared for.
It was a shaky, scary thing. At that moment, nobody knew. We didn't know if she was gonna make it or not.
Miraculously, after hours of open-heart surgery, doctors finally stabilize LaTanya. They place her into a medically induced coma to increase her chances of survival. Across town, members of the Wake County Sheriff's Office focus their search for Nathan Holden based on intel from the family.
He's just killed 2 people, tried to kill another person. He's armed and dangerous. So these deputies are going to do whatever they need to do. Doesn't matter that it's the middle of the night. They've been working on this case, for hours and hours. They send a team to a location about 10 miles from the crime scene, from the Taylor's home, where they believe he's hiding.
He had family that was not too far away. The other deputies that weren't on scene at our location responded to that location thinking that he may be there. Due to the nature of what had just occurred and not knowing what kind of weapons Mr. Holden had, where he was located, anything of that nature, the other deputies waited till our special response team arrived on scene. At this point, it was a little bit after midnight, I would say.
They begin their search near the abandoned truck. Then, one of the canine handlers thinks they see someone in a nearby field.
So now they have canines tracking him into this field. They know this guy is dangerous. They know he's armed. So they are going in knowing that they're putting their lives in danger to try to arrest him. Eventually, they get close, and he sees them, and he starts shooting at the deputies. He is not going to be taken in easily. He makes that very clear.
Wake County Sheriff's deputies are engaged in a tense gunfight with murder suspect Nathan Holden.
We've heard a lot of situations where, you hear suicide by cop, right? You hear somebody shoots at police so that they will then be killed.
Holden finally realizes he has no way out.
At that point, Mr. Holden gave up. He surrendered that evening. They took him into custody and charged him with 2 counts of murder.
He admits to shooting his estranged wife, LaTanya, and her parents, but won't say why. There's only one other person who might have the answers authorities are looking for.
LaTanya's in a coma. Nobody really believes there's a lot of hope that she's going to wake up. But 7 days after she goes into that coma, after she's shot and she's beaten with the butt of that gun, she wakes up.
When I wake up from my coma, tubes everywhere, tubes in my mouth, and, difficult to speak. I had a gunshot wound to the heart, point blank range, which hit my major organs, my stomach, my kidneys, my liver. Then it comes back up and exits out the middle of my back. I'm looking around, can't really speak, but I'm like, Mom. I was asking where was my mom. I was like, I want to know what happened to my parents.
That's when we had to tell her, everything that happened, that they didn't survive.
In my mind, I'm thinking like, what do you mean they didn't make it? The next question was, where are my kids? They said the kids are okay. And I was like, good. And then I say, did they catch him? They say yes, they caught him. And that's when I find out that I've been in a coma for a week.
In addition to all of these physical injuries that this woman is dealing with, she now has to begin grieving her parents. So she wakes up on a Wednesday. She learns the funeral for her parents is on a Saturday. And she tells the doctors, I'm going to my parents' funeral.
The doctors didn't know if I would be paralyzed, but I just wanted to say goodbye.
Against all odds, LaTanya finds the strength to be there to mourn with her family.
As soon as I saw my mother at the funeral, I immediately hugged her tightly, couldn't let go of her. Balls out crying, and just emotions everywhere. I thought she was gone. I couldn't let her go.
The following day, LaTanya agrees to sit down with investigators and explain the events leading up to the shooting. She says the warning signs began long before they separated.
He started drinking a lot. He started selling drugs. He started hanging around with the wrong crowd. And he knew how I felt about those things. And he just told me he didn't care. He was just type of person that he didn't accept everything was my fault. You know, even if he was wrong, it was going to be my fault. It was almost like it was a different person from who I married. You know, this used to be my best friend. This used to be the person that I could talk to. My exit strategy began probably about a year before actually leaving. He was caught selling cocaine. Some guys came into our home and beat him and robbed him, and my kids were home. I was not there, and it was just spiraling out of control.
The final straw came one day when Jeremy was late returning from school.
I came back home, and my dad was there, and he came in the room and asked, where you been at? And I said, I was at the court playing ball, and he came back with a metal broom and beat me to pieces with it.
He beat him so bad, it was a metal broom that it broke in half.
At that point, she says, I can't do this anymore. I have to protect my children. I have to get out of this marriage. I have to get out of this house. And she leaves.
But getting away from Nathan was even more difficult than LaTanya imagined.
The courts had come up with a custody plan for the two of them after the marriage failed, where they would share custody of the children and they would have these public drop-off points where they would exchange the children on a regular basis. Nathan would use that moment to try to threaten her, try to intimidate her, try to make her fearful.
One day, he was especially aggressive over the phone.
He called me and was like, you need to come home and you need to bring my kids home. And he was like, if you don't, I'm coming over there. I'm coming over there to get my kids. And my dad called the police.
Nathan is really ugly, unhinged, angry, and the police officer tells LaTanya, you need to get a restraining order, and you need to get it right away.
The following day, LaTanya went to the police station to pick up paperwork for the restraining order. But what should have been a simple chore became frightening.
When I walked back to my car, Nathan walked up behind me. And he is cursing me out, finger in my face, calling me a B, calling me a hoe. What am I doing? What am I doing? Doing something behind his back. He was just cursing me. I've never seen him like this before.
And so she talks to him and says, hey, let's see if we can work this out. Let's go somewhere and talk.
To calm Nathan down, LaTanya suggested they drive separately to a nearby restaurant to talk. On the way, she got an alarming call from Jeremy's school.
The guy on the phone says, I'm an officer from your son's school. He said, where's Nathan? And I said, he's following behind me. He says, can you get somewhere safe? I said, what happened? He said, Nathan has called your brother and called this school, and he had said he's gonna kill all of y'all today. And so I make this U-turn, and Nathan's throwing up his hands like, what are you doing? I go back to the police station and pull up and just run inside the building. I said, help me, help me, help me. My husband gonna kill me, my husband gonna kill me.
LaTanya Allen tells investigators that her estranged husband Nathan Holden's threats of violence came to a head on January 2nd, 2014, when he first threatened to kill her.
He's just following me. I run inside the police station and I bang on the door. They send him out looking for him. They couldn't find him.
At the time, a judge issued a restraining order. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to keep Nathan away. LaTanya shares her version of what happened 3 months later, including harrowing details the child witnesses couldn't have known.
So April 9th, I get a call from him early in the morning, probably about 6, 7. I'm on my way to work and I just ignore the phone call. He calls me a few times during that day. He calls my job a few times. I just ignore the calls. This was a Wednesday night, and typically I go to church on Wednesdays for a Bible study. And that day when I got off of work, I immediately got sick. I don't know what was wrong with me. I couldn't eat, my stomach was so upset. I was just so sick. I couldn't go to church. This is Jeremy's week to be with his dad, so he's with his dad. And so my mom takes the girls to church, and me and my dad's at home. I'm just resting, asleep. He's calling my phone, so I'm ignoring the phone calls.
LaTanya says she woke up around 9:30 p.m.
I hear my son come through the door. He wakes me up. Hey, Mom. What are you doing? He's like, what are you doing? And I was like, I'm asleep. I was like, what are you doing? He was like, I don't know. Dad wanted to come here. And the next thing I know, I hear gunshots. And I hear Nathan say, somebody gonna talk to me today.
He didn't care about the restraining order. He didn't care about what was about to happen, what could happen. First, he kills her mother, Angelia, who is in her bedroom. He then chases her father, who runs out of the house, and chases him like a dog, tracks him down on the lawn, and shoots and kills him on the front lawn of his home.
I'm trying to get the kids in a closet. And I put them in a closet. I called 911. I said, my husband is here. I said, I have a restraining order and he's shooting. And I knew I was next. Next thing you know, he comes to the back of the room and he starts punching me in my face. He starts beating me, and then he starts pistol whipping me. And I'm just fighting back, just begging him, please stop, don't kill me right here. Don't kill me in front of my kids. I said, you can take me away, just don't kill me right here. And he's punching me and beating me. And then I remember still on the floor. And I remember yelling, Jesus. Pow. Another gunshot goes off. And I just remember everything going slow. And I knew I was dying. And then the next thing I remember was, I catch my breath, like life was just back at me. And they say, she's alive, and just all these people running over to me. And I'm like, I can't breathe. I remember them getting me out on a stretcher and the air hitting me, and it was just like this big gush of just cold air. It felt so good because I was on fire. And then I went out again. And I didn't wake up until 7 days later.
Nathan Holden pleads not guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and assault with a deadly weapon. On February 14, 2017, nearly 3 years after the triple shooting, the trial finally begins.
You had the victim who survived this horrible attack was also grieving her parents and protecting her children. Then all of a sudden you have to walk into this courtroom and you have to relive this nightmare. You have to relive the night your parents were killed, the night that you almost died, and the night that your children witnessed all of this.
We had to prep for it. The kids had to prep for it. It was a lot, you know. By then, you know, it was almost like I'm just ready for this to be over.
My emotions when I saw my father in court was all over the place. I was scared, nervous, shocked. I was scared that he might talk to me. I was told not to say nothing to him.
The prosecution submits days of witness testimony and evidence to prove Nathan's assault wasn't a crime of passion, but a premeditated act of vengeance.
His actions, his choices were about hate.
I was just still fighting and begging him, just take me away. I didn't want my children to see me dead. And Nathan literally is right there, you know, across from me. And the entire time just staring me down, trying to intimidate me and make me scared.
But she really gave the jury an insight into who this man was, how he had treated her, and how all of those small acts of anger and violence and abuse had led up to this moment.
I think Nathan's motivation was revenge, to get back at me because I hadn't lived. And it just got to a point he couldn't control me anymore.
He couldn't handle her wanting to move on, and maybe something in him did snap.
Nathan's behavior in the courtroom doesn't help his case.
He was very combative, very irritated, loud outbursts at times. He even had to be restrained. We call it the Hannibal Lecter chair. But he had to sit in there for a couple of days.
A social worker took the stand. She had talked to Nathan after the situation, and the social worker testified that Nathan said they all got what they deserved.
It takes jurors a little over a day to reach a verdict. On February 27, 2017, they find Nathan Holden guilty on all counts.
When a verdict came across, it's just a sense of relief, like finally, you know, some type of justice, closure.
Instead of the death penalty, Nathan is given 2 consecutive life sentences for killing Angelia and Sylvester Taylor, plus an additional 25 years for the attempted murder of his estranged wife.
The day my father was sentenced, I felt relief.
I was at peace with him getting the 2 life sentences, as long as he wasn't ever getting out.
I miss my grandparents very much, each and every day. As time go by and as time heals, as a family, we're slowly coming back to how it was, and we're all trying to put the past behind us.
I met LaTanya a few months after the incident. The beautiful thing is that while she was going through so much pain and disappointment and discomfort and all this trauma, she was helping other people. A lot of us don't get the opportunity to encounter miracles in the flesh.
I was proud of LaTanya for pulling through. It was amazing to see someone go through that and to still be able to forgive. It's almost like
there are crimes that end when the killer is arrested. There are crimes that end when a verdict is read, when a prison door closes, when the name of the person responsible finally becomes known. And then there are crimes that refuse to end. The victims are gone. The courtroom eventually empties. The newspapers move on to the next story. Years become decades, and the people who once filled the headlines become names buried beneath layers of history. But sometimes one case remains. Not because the killer escaped. Not because investigators never discovered who was responsible. But because the question left behind is more disturbing than the crime itself. What do you do with a person who proves, again and again, that he can kill? In Toronto, Canada, during the 1950s, that question would begin with a 17-year-old boy named Peter Woodcock. At 17, Woodcock was still legally a child in the eyes of society around him. He was young enough to be viewed to the language of juvenile rehabilitation, young enough for authorities to believe that intervention might still change the direction of his life. But by then, something had already gone terribly wrong. In 1956, a 7-year-old boy named John Dick was killed. John was not a criminal. He was not a dangerous man. He was a child. His life should have stretched far beyond that moment. There should have been birthdays that had not yet happened. School years still waiting for him. Friendships that had not yet been made. Ordinary mornings and ordinary evenings that would have seemed completely insignificant at the time. Instead, his life became one of 3 names that would eventually define the history of Peter Woodcock. John Dick, Robert May, Leslie Mahaffey. 3 young victims. 3 lives stopped before adulthood. And behind those names was a story that would force Canadian authorities to confront one of the most uncomfortable problems in criminal justice. What happens when a young person who has already committed murder remains capable of extreme violence even after being taken out of ordinary society? Woodcock's first known killing happened in Toronto in 1956. He was 17. John Dick was 7. That 10-year difference is important, but numbers alone cannot communicate the imbalance between them. One was an adolescent on the edge of adulthood. The other was a little boy. Woodcock approached John and took him to a secluded area. John was then killed. The discovery of what had happened transformed the case immediately. Authorities were no longer dealing with a troubled teenager whose behavior might be dismissed as disturbing or difficult. They were dealing with a 17-year-old who had taken the life of a child. Woodcock was arrested. The machinery of the justice system began to move, and because he was still a minor, the response was shaped by the assumptions of the time about juvenile offenders. Punishment mattered, but so did rehabilitation. A young offender was not necessarily considered a finished human being. There was still an expectation that intervention, structure, supervision, and treatment might redirect a life that had gone dangerously off course. Woodcock was placed within the juvenile correctional system. For a moment, perhaps, the story seemed to have reached its natural conclusion. A dangerous young man had been identified. A child was dead. The offender was in custody. The community was protected. But that apparent ending was an illusion, because the most disturbing part of the Peter Woodcock story was not what happened before authorities caught him. It was what happened after. In 1957, approximately a year after the killing of John Dick, another teenager was dead. His name was Robert May. He was 15 years old, and Woodcock was not a free man when it happened. He was already under institutional control. That single fact changes the shape of the entire story. The first murder could be viewed as a terrible act committed by a disturbed 17-year-old outside the walls of the system. The second raised a much harder question. If a person has already demonstrated that he can kill and authorities take him into custody, what happens when the walls of that institution are not enough? Robert May's death meant that the danger had not simply disappeared when Woodcock was removed from ordinary society. The institution itself had become part of the story. The problem was no longer only Peter Woodcock. It was a question of how society should contain, assess, and manage someone like him. And then came another death. In 1959, a 15-year-old named Leslie Mahaffey was killed. Once again, Woodcock was under the control of the system. 3 young lives had now been lost. John Dick was 7. Robert May was 15. Leslie Mahaffey was 15. The ages alone create a chilling pattern. None of them had reached adulthood. None of them had lived long enough to see the ordinary future that people their age usually take for granted. And the person connected to all 3 deaths was still young himself. That contrast would follow Peter Woodcock for the rest of his life. The victims remained forever frozen at the ages at which they died. Woodcock did not. He grew older. The 17-year-old became a young man. The young man became middle-aged. Middle age eventually gave way to old age. But the names of the victims did not age with him. John remained 7. Robert remained 15. Leslie remained 15. That is one of the most unsettling features of any long criminal history. Time passes differently for the offender and the victims. The offender may spend decades changing, receiving treatment, being evaluated, being classified, and reconsidered. The victims do none of those things. Their lives have only one date that matters, the date they ended. For Woodcock, however, the story stretched across more than half a century. And with every passing decade, the central question became more complicated. Could someone who had committed horrific violence as a teenager ever truly change? Could a person who had spent decades under institutional supervision eventually become safe enough to return to society? Could treatment alter the risk? Could age weaken the impulses that had once made him dangerous? Or could a history of violence remain hidden beneath years of silence? These were not abstract questions. They had names attached to them. John, Robert, Leslie. For the families of those victims, the passage of time could not erase what had happened. A criminal case can reach a legal conclusion, but grief does not follow a court calendar. There is no sentence that restores a child to his parents. There is no medical evaluation that reverses a death. There is no institutional reform that gives a family back the decades that were stolen from them. And so the Peter Woodcock case eventually became something larger than the story of one killer. It became a story about the limits of rehabilitation. It became a story about the difference between punishment and protection. It became a story about what happens when a society must decide whether someone who committed murder as a young person can ever be trusted with freedom again. And beneath all those questions was another one, quieter and more difficult. At what point does a human being stop being defined entirely by the worst thing he has done? For most people, the answer can remain philosophical. For the families connected to this case, it could never be. Their perspective began with something much simpler. Someone they loved was gone. Peter Woodcock's early life had already contained signs of serious behavioral and psychological problems. He struggled socially and displayed disturbing behavior at a young age. Violence and troubling fixations emerged early enough to become part of the eventual understanding of his history. But it is important not to turn that history into a simple formula. A difficult childhood does not automatically produce a murderer. Psychological problems do not automatically produce violence. Social isolation does not automatically lead to killing. There is no single explanation that can transform a complicated human life into a neat sequence of causes and effects. That is precisely why Woodcock's story is so difficult. The temptation in a case like this is to look backward and search for a moment when everything suddenly makes sense. A childhood incident, a disturbing behavior, a warning sign, a diagnosis, a failure by an institution, a decision that should have been different, something that, if identified clearly enough, could make the entire story understandable. But real lives rarely work that way. Woodcock's history developed over time, and the institutions dealing with him developed alongside it. The authorities had to respond to a young offender who had already killed. Doctors and mental health professionals had to confront questions about his psychological condition. Correctional personnel had to manage someone whose behavior had already demonstrated an extreme capacity for violence. And society had to decide how much weight to give rehabilitation when the consequences of being wrong could be catastrophic. The dilemma was brutally simple. If Woodcock could change, permanent confinement might eventually seem unjust. If he could not change, releasing him could put other lives at risk. There was no way to know the future with absolute certainty. But the cost of being wrong was not equal on both sides. For decades, that problem followed Woodcock. He became one of the most long-term confined offenders in Canadian history, spending the overwhelming majority of his adult life within correctional and psychiatric institutions. The young man who had once been the subject of a juvenile murder case gradually became an elderly prisoner whose past remained unusually difficult to separate from every discussion about his future. As the years passed, the question of release could not be considered without returning to beginning. 1956. A 7-year-old boy, John Dick. Then 1957. A 15-year-old boy, Robert May. Then 1959. Another 15-year-old, Leslie Mahaffey. The years between those dates were short. The years that followed would be extraordinarily long. More than 50 years would pass between the first killing and Woodcock's death in 2010. Half a century is long enough for entire generations to be born and grow old. Long enough for neighborhoods to change. Long enough for institutions to change names, policies, and philosophies. Long enough for the language used to describe mental illness and criminal behavior to change dramatically. But the essential fact of the case remained. 3 young people were dead. 1 man had survived them by decades. And the system had spent those decades trying to answer a question that had no painless solution. Was Woodcock still dangerous? Or had the person who committed those killings ceased to exist in any meaningful psychological sense? Age can change a human being. Treatment can change a human being. Experience can change a human being. But some histories are so violent that every claim of transformation must be measured against what came before. That is what makes this story different from a conventional murder case. There is no simple chase. No mystery killer disappearing into the night. No final revelation in which investigators suddenly identify an unknown suspect. The identity of Peter Woodcock became known. The harder mystery was what to do with him afterward. And that question would remain alive long after the newspapers had stopped treating him as a teenage killer from Toronto. Imagine the passage of time. The world outside continues moving. Cars change. Buildings change. People who were children become parents. Parents become grandparents. A city grows around the memories of those who were killed. Inside institutions, however, time has a different rhythm. Days become routines. Routines become years. Years become decades. And somewhere inside that system is a man carrying a history that began when he was only 17. The same person who once stood at the beginning of adulthood would eventually become an elderly man. Yet the public record would always pull him backward. Back to the child he killed. Back to the teenagers who followed. Back to the moment when a juvenile murder case became something much larger. Peter Woodcock died in 2010. By then, the world in which his crimes had occurred was almost unrecognizable compared with the Toronto of the 1950s. But the dead did not move forward with the world. John Dick did not become an adult. Robert May did not become an adult. Leslie Mahaffey did not become an adult. Their futures ended before they had the opportunity to discover who they might become. That is where the story truly begins. Not with the image of a monster, not with a sensational description of a killer, but with a question. What happens when a 17-year-old commits an act so terrible that it changes the course of several lives at once? What happens when the punishment does not end the danger? What happens when the offender grows old, but the victims remain forever young? And what happens when, after decades of confinement, society is forced to ask whether a person who once seemed incapable of change has actually changed? The answers would unfold over more than 50 years. They would involve murder, juvenile justice, institutional failure, psychiatric assessment, confinement, rehabilitation, and the unbearable arithmetic of risk. But before all that, there were 3 young people whose lives should have continued. Their names were John Dick, Robert May, and Leslie Mahaffey. And there was a 17-year-old boy named Peter Woodcock. In 1956, their lives entered the same story. More than half a century later, that story would finally come to an end with Woodcock's death. But for the people left behind, there was never going to be an ending that felt complete, because a prison sentence can end. A criminal investigation can end. A man's life can end. Memory does not. And neither does the question of what might have happened if, somewhere along the way, someone had found a different answer. But before the questions about rehabilitation, psychiatric assessment, and lifelong confinement could dominate the story. There was a much younger Peter Woodcock. There was a time before his name became associated with 3 deaths, before doctors, correctional officials, and courts would spend decades examining his behavior, before the word dangerous became inseparable from his identity. There was simply a boy growing up in Toronto. The details of a childhood can be deceptively ordinary when viewed from a distance. A person can pass through schools, neighborhoods, and institutions while the people around him see only fragments of what is happening beneath the surface. A troubling behavior may appear isolated. A disturbing fixation may be dismissed as childish. A social difficulty may be interpreted as shyness or immaturity. A violent act may seem like an incident rather than a warning. But when investigators and specialists later reconstruct a life after a serious crime, those fragments acquire a different weight. The question becomes whether anyone could have seen what was coming. In Woodcock's case, there were indications that he struggled from an early age. His behavior was described as abnormal, and there were concerns involving his psychological development and his ability to function normally around other people. Yet knowing that a child is troubled is not the same thing as knowing that he will become a murderer. That distinction matters. There is a dangerous simplicity in looking backward and treating every childhood problem as evidence of an inevitable future. Millions of children experience instability, behavioral problems, social isolation, or psychological difficulties without ever becoming violent criminals. Woodcock's history cannot be reduced to one childhood characteristic. It was a progression. And somewhere within that progression, the boundaries that normally separate disturbing behavior from catastrophic violence were crossed. By the time 1956 arrived, Woodcock was 17. 17 is an age that occupies an uncomfortable place between childhood and adulthood. A 17-year-old may look almost grown. He may be physically capable of adult responsibilities, but emotionally, psychologically, and legally, he is still developing. The juvenile justice system of the period operated with the belief that young offenders could be redirected. That belief will be severely tested by Peter Woodcock. The first victim was John Dick, 7 years old. The difference between 7 and 17 is more than a number. At 7, a child's world is still largely controlled by adults. Parents decide where he goes. Adults determine what is safe. Children depend on older people to recognize dangers that they themselves may not understand. That dependence makes the circumstances surrounding John's death particularly painful. Woodcock approached the child and took him to an isolated location. Then John was killed. The facts are stark. There is no need to decorate them. A 7-year-old boy went with another person. He did not return alive. The consequences spread immediately beyond the place where the killing occurred. A family lost a child. Investigators were confronted with a 17-year-old suspect, and a justice system designed, at least in part, around the possibility of rehabilitation was suddenly responsible for determining what should happen next. Woodcock was arrested. The legal process began, but the arrest created another question that will become central to the entire case. Was this a terrible act committed by a troubled teenager who could still be rehabilitated? Or was it the first visible expression of a level of violence that will remain with him? No one could answer that question with certainty. The system had to act anyway. Woodcock entered juvenile custody. The physical separation from society was supposed to serve several purposes. It removed him from the public, imposed consequences, and created an opportunity for assessment and intervention. The first part appeared straightforward. He was no longer free to move through the community. But the second and third parts were far more difficult. Assessment is not prophecy. Treatment is not a guarantee. And confinement is only as effective as the system's ability to understand and control the person inside it. Within approximately a year, another young person would die. Robert May was 15. The fact that his death occurred while Woodcock was already under institutional control would become one of the defining elements of the case. The meaning of confinement changed at that moment. A prison, reform school, or psychiatric institution is built around a basic assumption. The people inside can be controlled. Doors can be locked. Movement can be restricted. Staff can supervise. Rules can be imposed. But no institution is simply a building. It is a system made of people, procedures, judgments, and assumptions. When something goes wrong inside it, the question is not merely how one individual acted. The question becomes how that individual was able to act at all. Robert May's death, therefore, created a second layer of responsibility. There was the responsibility of the offender, and there was the responsibility of a system that had already been warned. Woodcock was no longer an unknown quantity. He had already killed. The authorities already knew that. Yet another 15-year-old had died. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. For the families of the victims, however, the word pattern could never capture what had actually been lost. A pattern is something investigators see on paper. A family sees an empty place at the table, a missing voice, a future that never happened. The three names would eventually become part of the case file, but they had existed long before they became evidence. John Dick had been a child. Robert May had been a teenager. Leslie Mahaffey would be another teenager. Each had relationships, routines, and a place in a world outside the criminal justice system. The tragedy of true crime can sometimes become distorted by the attention given to the offender. The killer gets a biography. The killer gets psychological analysis. The killer's childhood is examined. The killer's diagnoses are debated. The killer's prison history becomes the subject of documentaries and articles. Meanwhile, the victims can become little more than names. That is not what should happen here. The most important fact about John, Robert, and Leslie is not what their deaths contributed to the story of Peter Woodcock. It is that their lives existed independently of him. Their lives mattered before they became connected to his, and they remained important after his name became famous. The second killing was followed by another period of confinement and assessment. Then came 1959. 3 years had passed since the death of John Dick. Woodcock was now approximately 20 years old. But the central problem had become even more serious. Leslie Mahaffey, 15, was killed. Once again, the killing occurred while Woodcock was under control of authorities. 3 victims, 3 young lives, and a young offender whose capacity for violence had not been eliminated by custody. At this point, the case could no longer be understood simply as a question of what happened in 1956. The first murder had become the beginning of a much larger history. The second had challenged the effectiveness of juvenile confinement. The third forced the system to confront the possibility that the problem was not temporary. Something fundamental had to change. Woodcock's case moved deeper into the world of psychiatric assessment and long-term institutional management. This is where the story becomes less visible from the outside. A murder investigation is dramatic because the events are concentrated. There's a crime. There's a search for answers. There are arrests, interviews, and legal proceedings. But long-term psychiatric confinement is different. There are no dramatic endings every few weeks. Instead, there are assessments, observations, reports, decisions, reviews. Years pass, then more years. The outside world changes. The person inside changes. And yet the original crimes remain fixed. This creates a strange tension. If a person spends decades without committing another violent offense because he's confined, what does that prove? It may demonstrate that he can behave without violence under strict conditions, but it does not necessarily answer what he would do without those conditions. That distinction would become increasingly important as Woodcock aged. A young offender who commits murder is one kind of problem. An elderly man with a history of multiple killings is another. Age can reduce physical strength. It can alter impulse control. It can change the nature of a person's behavior. But risk assessment cannot be based on age alone. The past still exists. And Woodcock's past was extraordinarily difficult to ignore. As the decades passed, the question of whether he could ever be released became a recurring issue. The debate was not simply about whether he had served enough time. It was about whether he remained dangerous. That distinction is crucial. Punishment asks what a person deserves because of something he has done. Risk assessment asks what he might do in the future. Rehabilitation asks whether he has changed. Public safety asks what happens if that assessment is wrong. These questions can point in different directions. A person may have been severely punished and still present a risk. A person may have changed and still carry a history that makes release difficult to justify. A person may appear stable for decades inside a highly controlled environment, and yet remain impossible to assess with certainty outside it. Woodcock's life became an unusually long test of those competing principles. The man who had committed his first murder at 17 was no longer a teenager. He was growing old inside institutions. Meanwhile, the victims' families continued living with consequences that could not be reviewed, modified, or reversed. There would never be a reassessment of John's future. No psychologist could determine whether Robert would become a father. No court could calculate what Leslie might have accomplished. Those possibilities had disappeared permanently. The asymmetry was unavoidable. Woodcock could be assessed again and again because he was alive. The victims could not. That difference would remain at the heart of every later discussion. There's another uncomfortable aspect of the case. Woodcock's story is often tempted to frame as a question of evil. That word is emotionally powerful, but it can also close the investigation rather than deepen it. Calling someone evil does not explain why he acted. It does not explain the failures that surrounded him. It does not explain the psychology involved. It does not tell us whether treatment worked. And it certainly does not tell us how a society should respond to someone who has demonstrated extreme violence. The harder approach is to look at the person without losing sight of the victims, to examine behavior without excusing it, to consider psychological factors without turning them into defenses for murder, to ask whether rehabilitation is possible without pretending that the consequences of violence can be undone. That is the uncomfortable territory Peter Woodcock's case occupies. His story sits at the intersection of criminal responsibility and mental health. It asks how much a person's past should determine his future. It asks whether a person can be transformed by decades of confinement. And it asks how much uncertainty a society should be willing to tolerate when the potential cost is another innocent life. For Woodcock, the answer ultimately involved extraordinary longevity in custody. For the victims, there was no second chance. By the time the 21st century arrived, Woodcock had spent most of his adult existence within institutions. The world outside had transformed around him. The technology, culture, and social attitudes of the 1950s were long gone. The language surrounding mental illness had changed. The understanding of juvenile offenders had evolved. Ideas about rehabilitation had changed. Standards for risk assessment had changed. Yet the fundamental facts remained stubbornly old. A 7-year-old had been killed. 2 15-year-olds had been killed. And the person responsible had survived long enough to become an elderly man. That is the point at which the story becomes almost impossible to separate from the passage of time. Imagine the distance between 1956 and 2010. It is not simply 54 years on a calendar. It is a lifetime. A child born in 1956 could have grown up, attended school, entered the workforce, married, raised children, and become a grandparent before Woodcock died. Entire generations could have lived and disappeared during the period in which Woodcock remained part of the Canadian correctional and psychiatric system. Yet the first victim would always be 7. The second and third would always be 15. This is what time does to a criminal case. It changes almost everything except the central fact. The victims cannot age. The offender can. And that difference can make an old case feel strangely present. The names do not become less tragic because decades have passed. If anything, the passage of time can make the contrast sharper. We know how much life normally fits inside 50 years. We know how much can happen between childhood and old age. We know how many experiences can fill an ordinary human lifespan. Then we look at 3 lives that stop before adulthood. That is the real scale of what was lost. Peter Woodcock's eventual death in 2010 closed a biological chapter of his life. But it did not resolve the questions his case had raised. It did not change the circumstances of the killings. It did not return the victims. And it did not erase the debate over whether the systems that handled them had done enough, failed in critical ways, or face a problem that no institution could solve with certainty. Perhaps that is why the case continues to matter. Not because Peter Woodcock was famous, not because his story offers a clean structure of a mystery, but because it forces us to examine what happens after society has identified a dangerous person. Catching someone is only the beginning. Confining someone is only one solution. Treating someone is another. Releasing someone is perhaps the most difficult decision of all. Every stage requires a judgment about the future. And the future is something no court, doctor, prison official, or investigator can see. They can only estimate. They can study behavior. They can examine history. They can observe change. They can compare risks. But certainty remains out of reach. In Woodcock's case, the consequences of uncertainty were measured in human lives. That is why the story cannot begin with the end. It must begin with the boy who was 17, the child who was 7, the system that believed custody could contain the danger, the second victim who proved that belief was not enough, the third victim who made the pattern impossible to dismiss, and then the decades that followed, decades in which Peter Woodcock would become older, while the names of the dead remained exactly the same. John Dick, Robert May, Leslie Mahaffey. 3 names, 3 ages, 3 futures that disappeared, and one question that would follow Peter Woodcock for the rest of his life. Could a person responsible for such violence ever truly become someone else? The answer would never be found in a single courtroom. It would not be found in one diagnosis. It would not be found simply because years had passed. It would be tested slowly, over decades, inside the institutions where Woodcock lived. And while the man changed with time, the victims remained exactly where history had left them. At 7, at 15, at 15. That is where we must begin. At 7, at 15, and at 15, their lives had stopped. Peter Woodcock's had not. That difference is easy to overlook when a criminal case is reduced to dates, names, and sentences. But it is perhaps the most important fact in the entire story. John Dick would never know what adulthood looked like. Robert May would never discover the person he might have become. Leslie Mahaffey would never experience the ordinary years that should have followed 15. Woodcock, however, would have those years. He would have decades. He would grow older while the memory of the victims remained fixed in time. He would pass through institutions while the outside world changed around him. He would be evaluated, observed, and discussed by people who had never known the 17-year-old boy who first entered the criminal justice system. And eventually, the question would no longer be whether a troubled teenager could be rehabilitated. It would become whether an elderly man could ever be trusted outside the walls that had contained him for most of his life. That transformation is what makes the Woodcock case so unsettling. The person at the center of the story did not remain frozen at the age of his first crime. His victims did. There is something deeply disturbing about that imbalance. When we look at an old photograph of a victim, we instinctively imagine the years that should have followed. We imagine the face changing with age. We imagine a child becoming a teenager becoming an adult growing old. But in cases like this, those imagined years never existed. History stopped them, and yet history continued for the person who caused their deaths. That is the paradox at the center of Peter Woodcock's life. The passage of time could change him, but it could never change what had happened. Perhaps this is why the case cannot be understood simply as a story about murder. It is a story about time. Time before the first killing. Time between the killings. Time spent behind institutional walls. Time spent under psychiatric observation. Time spent waiting for decisions. Time spent asking whether the danger had finally disappeared. And time for families of the victims who had continued living with an absence that no amount of institutional progress could repair. The longer Woodcock lived, the more unusual the case became. The teenager from the 1950s became a man from another era. The institutions that had once treated him as a juvenile offender became part of a much longer history of confinement. The psychological theories used to understand him changed. The methods used to evaluate risk changed. The philosophy of corrections changed. Canada itself changed. But the question remained. Was Peter Woodcock still the same danger he had been when he was 17? Or could decades of confinement and treatment produce a genuine transformation? There is no simple way to answer that question. Human beings are not machines. A person can change. A person can learn. A person can mature. A person can regret. A person can become less impulsive, less aggressive, more stable. But a history of extreme violence cannot simply be deleted. The past remains part of the risk calculation. And when the past contains multiple killings of young people, the threshold for trust becomes extraordinarily high. This is where the story leaves the comfortable territory of hindsight. Today, knowing how the story unfolded, it is tempting to look backward and say that the warning signs were obvious, but they were not necessarily obvious at the time. People had to make decisions with incomplete information. They had to judge a teenager whose psychological development was still occurring. They had to determine what kind of treatment might work. They had to decide how much supervision was necessary. And they had to balance rehabilitation against public safety. Those decisions were made in a world very different from ours. The understanding of psychology was different. The understanding of juvenile crime was different. The institutions themselves were different. That context matters. It does not excuse what happened. It does not diminish the responsibility of the person who committed the killings, but it helps explain why the Woodcock case became such a difficult test for the Canadian system. The question was never simply, what did Peter Woodcock do? That question had an answer. The harder questions were, why did he do it? Could he change? Could anyone reliably determine whether he had changed? And if there was uncertainty, who should bear the consequences of being wrong? Those questions do not have easy endings. For the victims, the answer had already been determined. They had paid the ultimate price. For society, however, the decision continued for decades. Every year of Woodcock's life created another opportunity to ask whether the risk had changed. Every new assessment carried the possibility of a different conclusion. Every discussion about rehabilitation existed alongside the memory of 3 young people who would never benefit from a second chance. That tension would follow Woodcock until the end. He would eventually die in 2010. But by then, the story had already crossed several generations. A case that began in the Toronto of the 1950s had survived into a completely different century. The world had become faster, more connected, more technologically advanced. Yet the fundamental human questions remain almost painfully old. What does justice mean when the victim cannot speak? What does rehabilitation mean when the original crime was committed against a child? How should society measure redemption? And perhaps most importantly, when the consequences of an error could be another death, how much uncertainty is acceptable? There is a temptation in true crime to search for a final moment, the arrest, the confession, the verdict, the sentence, the prison door closing, a moment when the story appears to settle into place. Peter Woodcock's case offers no such comfort. The arrest did not end the danger. Confinement did not immediately end the questions. The passage of time did not erase the past. And Woodcock's eventual death did not restore what had been taken. The case simply continued to evolve. That is why the story must be told carefully. Peter Woodcock was not born as a headline. John Dick was not born as a victim. Robert May was not born as a case number. Leslie Mahaffey was not born as a name in a criminal history. They were people. They lived before the crime. They had identities beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Their families knew them as sons, children, and loved ones. That is where the tragedy exists. Not in the mythology surrounding a killer, not in the fascination with violence, but in the ordinary lives that were destroyed. A 7-year-old child should have had decades ahead of him. A 15-year-old should have had decades ahead of him. Another 15-year-old should have had decades ahead of her. The word should is perhaps one of the most painful words in any account of violent crime. He should have grown up. He should have graduated. He should have made friends. He should have discovered what kind of man he would become. She should have grown older. She should have experienced the ordinary disappointments and joys that make up a human life. None of those possibilities happened. And while the victims disappeared from the future, Peter Woodcock remained in it. He lived through years they never received. That fact cannot be changed by psychology, law, or philosophy. It is simply the arithmetic of death. 3 lives ended. 1 life continued. And the life that continued became a decades-long question for an entire system. By the end, Peter Woodcock was no longer the 17-year-old who had entered the story in 1956. He was an elderly man whose life had been defined by confinement. But the transformation of the offender could never erase the permanence of the victim's deaths. That is a line we must keep in view as the story moves forward. Because the deeper we go into Woodcock's history, the more tempting it becomes to focus on him, his childhood, his behavior, his psychological condition, his crimes, his confinement, his evaluations, his possible rehabilitation, his future. But every time the story begins to revolve entirely around him, we must return to the people who lost everything. John, Robert, Leslie. Their names are not merely markers in Woodcock's biography. They are the reason the biography matters. And there is another reason this case remains relevant. The problems it exposed did not disappear with Woodcock. Every society must decide what to do with people who commit serious crimes while still young. Some offenders mature. Some change. Some remain dangerous. Some may respond to treatment. Others may not. The difficulty lies in determining which is which. No assessment can see the future. No institution can guarantee that a person will never become violent again. No sentence can undo a death. And no amount of remorse, if it exists, can return life to its family. That is the uncomfortable space between justice and uncertainty. Peter Woodcock spent decades inside that space, and the Canadian system spent decades trying to decide what his future should look like. His story, therefore, becomes a kind of test. A test of the belief that people can change. A test of the belief that punishment can protect society. A test of psychiatric assessment. A test of institutional supervision. And ultimately, a test of how much risk a society is willing to accept. The answer matters because mistakes in either direction have consequences. If a person who is genuinely rehabilitated is confined forever, the system may have failed its belief in redemption. If a person who remains dangerous is released, the consequences could be irreversible. There is no mathematical equation capable of making that decision painless. There is only judgment, and judgment can be wrong. That is what makes the story so difficult to close. Even after Woodcock died in 2010, there was no final answer capable of rewriting the past. The boy John Dick remained dead. Robert may remain dead. Leslie Mahaffey remained dead. And the man who had been connected to their deaths had lived long enough to become a figure from a completely different generation. Half a century had passed. The distance between the first murder and Woodcock's death was longer than many people live. But the essential story could still be stated in a few sentences. A 17-year-old killed a 7-year-old. While under institutional control, he killed again. Then he killed a third time. He spent most of his adult life confined. And until the end, society had to confront the question of whether he could ever safely return to it. Those facts are enough to make the case extraordinary. But the human story beneath them is what makes it unforgettable. Because the real horror is not simply that a person was capable of killing. It is that 3 young lives were reduced to final moments, while another life continued for decades. And somewhere between those two realities lies the entire tragedy. The story begins in Toronto. It begins in a different Canada. It begins with a troubled teenager and a 7-year-old boy. It begins before anyone knew how long the consequences would last. Before Robert May. Before Leslie Mahaffey. Before decades of confinement. Before the debates about rehabilitation. Before the elderly man whose name would remain attached to a crime committed more than half a century earlier. It begins when Peter Woodcock was 17. And when John Dick was 7. Everything that followed grew from that moment. The questions would become larger. The institutions would become more complicated. The years would accumulate. But the beginning would remain exactly where it had always been. A child was dead. A teenager was responsible. And a society that believed it could contain, understand, and perhaps rehabilitate the young offender was about to discover how difficult that promise could become. The rest of Peter Woodcock's life would be an attempt to answer a question that had begun with a single death. Could the future ever be trusted with the past? The answer would take more than 50 years to unfold. Toronto in the 1950s was a city in transition. It was growing, changing, and carried with it the confidence of a country that had emerged from the enormous disruption of war and was moving toward a new era. The streets were filled with families building ordinary lives. Children went to school, played outside, visited friends, and moved through neighborhoods where adults often believed that familiarity itself was a kind of protection. It was a different world from the one that would eventually inherit the story of Peter Woodcock. There were no smartphones in children's pockets, no instant messages connecting families to one another, no digital maps recording every movement, and no modern network of surveillance cameras quietly observing public spaces. Information moved more slowly. News traveled through newspapers, radio, and word of mouth. When a child disappeared, there was no instantaneous digital alert reaching thousands of people at once. The city depended heavily on people noticing things. A neighbor noticing that a child had not returned home. A family member realizing that something was wrong. A police officer remembering a face. An investigator connecting one detail to another. The human element was everywhere, and that mattered in a case involving a 17-year-old boy who would become responsible for a series of killings. Toronto was also a city where the boundaries between childhood and adulthood were understood differently from the way many people see them today. A teenager could be physically mature enough to appear intimidating, yet still be regarded by the justice system as someone whose character was not fully formed. The philosophy behind juvenile justice carried an important assumption. Young people were capable of change. A child who committed a serious offense was not necessarily viewed as a permanently formed criminal. There was room for correction, discipline, supervision, and rehabilitation. The logic was understandable. A 17-year-old had not lived long enough to accumulate the experiences of adulthood. His personality was still developing. His habits were still forming. His understanding of consequences was still changing. If something had gone wrong, perhaps it could still be repaired. That belief will become one of the most important ideas in the story of Peter Woodcock. Because when Woodcock entered the justice system, the authorities were not simply deciding what punishment he deserved. They were also deciding what kind of person they believed he could become. That distinction would follow him for decades. To understand why the case became so extraordinary, it is necessary to understand the person who entered that system. Peter Woodcock had been born in Toronto in 1939. His childhood was not described as uncomplicated. There were problems within his family environment, difficulties in his behavior, and signs of psychological disturbance. He struggled socially and displayed behavior that, viewed later through the full history of his life, appeared deeply troubling. But childhood warning signs rarely arrive with labels attached. A difficult child is not automatically a dangerous adult. A child who behaves strangely is not automatically destined for violence. A young person who struggles to make friends is not automatically a future murderer. That is one of the uncomfortable truths in retrospect. The people around a troubled child do not have the benefit of knowing the ending. They see fragments. They see an argument, a strange habit, a disturbing reaction, a failure to fit in, a moment of aggression. Then life moves on. Most of those moments never become crimes. Most troubled children do not become violent adults. That means the task of recognizing genuine danger is extraordinarily difficult. The question is not simply whether a child is different. The question is whether that difference is developing into something capable of causing serious harm. In Woodcock's case, the answer would eventually become undeniable. But before the murders, that answer did not yet exist. There was only a boy growing up in Toronto, and Toronto itself was a city where the ordinary and the disturbing could exist almost side by side without anyone immediately recognizing how they were connected. The streets were filled with movement. People went to work. Children went to school. Families built routines. The city expanded. The post-war years brought a sense of possibility and stability to many communities, but no city is ever completely safe simply because most of its residents are living ordinary lives. Danger does not announce itself. It can exist inside an ordinary neighborhood. It can appear in the form of someone who looks young, someone who does not immediately attract attention, someone who can walk through a familiar environment without appearing to be what he eventually becomes in the public imagination. That is one reason the age of Peter Woodcock matters so much. He was not an older stranger from some distant place. He was 17, a teenager, close enough to childhood that the system believed rehabilitation remained possible, old enough, however, to understand that certain actions were profoundly wrong. The first murder would force those two realities into conflict. John Dick was 7 years old. Woodcock was 17. The difference between those ages placed them on opposite sides of childhood. John was still at an age when adults were expected to provide protection. Woodcock was approaching adulthood, when society expected increasing independence and responsibility. And yet the two would become permanently connected by a crime that neither family could have anticipated. When John was killed in 1956, the event did not happen in the abstract. It happened in a real city, among real streets and real people. The details available to us should be treated carefully. It is tempting when telling an old crime story to reconstruct every minute with imagined weather, invented dialogue, and cinematic descriptions. But the danger of that approach is that imagination can begin to look like evidence. The truth of the case is already disturbing enough. A 17-year-old approached a 7-year-old child and took him to an isolated area. The child was killed. Those facts do not need artificial decoration. What matters is understanding the world around them. At the time, the concept of juvenile delinquency was a major concern within modern societies. Young offenders were not simply treated as smaller versions of adult criminals. Their age mattered. Their environment mattered. Their development mattered. There was an assumption that intervention could prevent a troubled young person from becoming permanently criminal. That philosophy contained compassion. It also contained risk. If the system was too harsh, it might destroy the possibility of rehabilitation. If it was too lenient, it might fail to protect other people. If officials misunderstood a dangerous young offender, the consequences could be devastating. Peter Woodcock's case would eventually expose that dilemma in its most severe form. After John's death, Woodcock was arrested and placed within the juvenile correctional system. At first glance, that was exactly what the system was designed to do. The offender was removed from the community. The public was protected from immediate contact. The young person could be assessed. And there was an opportunity to determine what might be done to prevent another offense. But there was a critical problem. The system was now dealing with a teenager who had already crossed a boundary that most people never approach. He had killed a child. That fact should have changed the way every subsequent decision was understood. The question was no longer simply whether Woodcock was troubled. He had demonstrated that his behavior could have fatal consequences. This is where the psychology of the case begins to intersect with the structure of the institution. A person does not exist separately from the environment around him. A troubled teenager placed inside an institution does not suddenly stop being troubled because a door closes behind him. The institution has to understand him. It has to monitor him. It has to recognize dangerous behavior. It has to determine what kind of supervision is necessary. And it has to decide whether the person is becoming safer or merely becoming more accustomed to confinement. Those are difficult judgments even today. In the 1950s, the tools, language, and understanding available to authorities were considerably different. The modern vocabulary surrounding psychological disorders, risk assessment, and rehabilitation had not yet developed into the systems familiar to us now. The people responsible for Woodcock were operating within the knowledge of their time. That context is essential. It does not erase responsibility. It does not make the killings less horrifying, but it explains why the case became such an important test of institutional judgment. The first murder should have been the beginning of a period of intense control and assessment. Instead, within roughly a year, another young person would die. Robert May was 15, and Woodcock was already in custody. That fact transformed the meaning of the first case. A dangerous teenager had not simply escaped supervision and committed another crime somewhere in the community. The second killing occurred within the environment that was supposed to contain him. Suddenly, the walls themselves became part of the story. An institution is supposed to create distance between a dangerous person and potential victims. But physical walls are not enough. There must also be supervision. There must be judgment. There must be an understanding of behavior. There must be systems capable of recognizing when ordinary routines are not sufficient. Robert May's death demonstrated that something had gone terribly wrong. And once that happened, the original assumption that confinement alone could solve the problem became much harder to maintain. The story was no longer only about a teenager who had committed murder. It was about a teenager who had committed murder and then, while already under institutional control, was connected to another death. That distinction would become central to every later discussion of Woodcock. Then, in 1959, another 15-year-old, Leslie Mahaffey, was killed. By this point, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. 3 young victims, 3 moments of irreversible loss, and a young offender whose life was becoming increasingly intertwined with the institutions meant to control him. The case had moved beyond the ordinary categories of juvenile crime. There was now a profound question about whether Woodcock could ever be managed safely. The answer could not simply be based on his age. He was getting older. But age was not the same thing as rehabilitation. A teenager becoming an adult does not automatically become a safer person. Likewise, a troubled person becoming older does not automatically eliminate whatever factors contributed to earlier violence. This would become increasingly important as Woodcock's confinement extended across decades. The world around him would change. He would change. But the question of risk would remain. The psychology of dangerousness is particularly difficult because it involves the future. Courts can determine what happened in the past. Investigators can establish facts. Witnesses can describe behavior. But no one can directly observe tomorrow. When an institution asks whether someone is safe to release, it is making a prediction. That prediction is based on evidence, but it remains a prediction. The person may have behaved well for years. He may have participated in treatment. He may have matured. He may appear calmer. He may be physically older and less capable of the violence associated with youth. But the past remains part of the calculation. In Woodcock's case, that past was extraordinarily severe. 3 young people had died. That fact would make every future assessment different from an ordinary rehabilitation case. There is also a human dimension that statistics can never capture. Risk assessment speaks in probabilities. Families experience loss in absolutes. For a family, the question is not whether the person responsible has a low, moderate, or high probability of reoffending. Their child is already dead. Their loss is not a probability. It is permanent. This creates a tension that would remain unresolved throughout Woodcock's life. The justice system must think about the future. The victims' families must live with the past. Both realities exist at the same time. Toronto continued to change while the case continued to unfold. The children who lived in the city in the 1950s eventually grew older. New families arrived. Neighborhoods changed. Technology advanced. The world moved further away from the era in which Woodcock committed his first murder. But for the people connected to the victims, the passage of time could not make the loss ordinary. A decade is long. 2 decades or longer. 3 decades can transform a society. Yet the death of a child does not become less final because 30 years have passed. The person responsible may become unrecognizable from his younger self. The victim remains exactly the same age forever. This is why the setting of the Woodcock case is not merely Toronto. It is also time. The story takes place across an enormous historical distance. It begins in the Canada of the 1950s and eventually reaches the 21st century. The institutions involved evolve. The theories change. The language changes. The public's understanding of mental illness changes. But the central facts remain fixed. That tension between change and permanence will define everything that follows. To understand Peter Woodcock, we therefore have to hold 2 images in our minds at once. The first is a 17-year-old boy entering a system that still believed young offenders could be redirected. The second is the elderly man who would eventually spend most of his life confined because of what happened during those early years. Between those 2 images lies more than half a century. And within that span are questions that have no easy answers. Could treatment work? Could a person who had committed murder as a teenager become psychologically different from the person who committed it? Could society ever know that change with enough certainty? And if certainty was impossible, What level of risk was acceptable? These questions would eventually become more important than the original question of punishment, because Woodcock's case was no longer about what happened on one day in Toronto. It was about what society should do for the rest of a dangerous person's life. That is an extraordinary burden to place on any institution. It requires people make decisions not only about crime, but about human nature. It requires them to decide whether people are capable of fundamental change. It requires them to distinguish between remorse and manipulation, stability and suppression, maturity and mere adaptation confinement. And it requires them to remember the victims every time the possibility of freedom is discussed. The setting of the story, then, is larger than city. It is a society trying to understand a kind of violence it was not prepared to explain. It is a juvenile justice system confronting a teenager who had already killed. It is a mental health system trying to understand a disturbed young man. It is a correctional system attempting to keep him contained. And it is a community forced to confront the possibility that the ordinary assumptions surrounding childhood and rehabilitation may not apply neatly to every young offender. The first murder brought Peter Woodcock into that system. The second showed the system's limits. The third deepened the crisis. And the decades that followed would turn a juvenile case into one of the longest and most difficult stories of confinement in Canada. But before the institutions, before the psychiatric assessments, before the arguments about rehabilitation and release, there were the victims. There was John Dick, 7 years old. There was Robert May, 15. There was Leslie Mahaffey, 15. Their stories did not begin with Peter Woodcock. They only became connected to his story because violence entered their lives. To understand what was taken from them, we have to step away from the offender. We have to leave the institutions behind for a moment. We have to stop looking at Woodcock as the center of the story. And we have to look at the 3 young people whose lives were ended before they had the chance to become adults. That is where the next chapter begins. The city that surrounded Peter Woodcock was not a place that knew it was standing at the beginning of a story that would last for more than half a century. That is one of the strange things about history. People living through an ordinary day rarely know which events will later become important. A street is simply a street. A school is simply a school. A neighborhood is simply where families live. A child walking home is simply a child walking home. No one looks at an ordinary afternoon and thinks that somewhere within the next few years, the memory of that time will become part of criminal investigation, a court record, or a family history marked permanently by loss. Toronto in the 1950s was filled with those ordinary moments. The city was expanding and changing as Canada moved through the post-war period. Families were building routines. Children occupied a world in which much of their daily life happened outdoors and within the physical boundaries of their neighborhoods. People knew the streets they lived on. They recognized familiar faces. Communities could feel close even when thousands of people lived only a short distance away. But familiarity is not the same thing as safety. A neighborhood can feel secure and still contain danger. A familiar face can still hide a private world that other people do not understand. And a young person who appears troubled can remain difficult to interpret until behavior becomes impossible to ignore. Peter Woodcock existed within that ordinary environment. He was born in Toronto in 1939, at a time when the city itself was entering a period of enormous change. His childhood unfolded during years that would shape the generation around him. The Second World War had a profound effect on Canadian families. The post-war years brought new expectations about prosperity, family life, and social stability. There was a growing belief in institutions and in the idea that social problems could be addressed through organized systems. Schools could educate. Hospitals could treat. Courts could punish. Correctional institutions could reform. Mental health institutions could contain and treat people whose behavior was considered dangerous or abnormal. There was confidence in structure. But structure only works when people understand what they are dealing with. And Peter Woodcock was difficult to understand. From an early age, he displayed behavioral and psychological problems. He struggled socially and exhibited behavior that distinguished him from other children. Looking backward, these details can appear like pieces of a puzzle. But at the time, they were not necessarily a puzzle. They were simply problems. A difficult child could be described as difficult. A child who behaved strangely could be considered troubled. A child who failed to fit in could be placed under supervision. The challenge was recognizing when those behaviors represented something far more dangerous. The human mind is naturally drawn to patterns. Once we know that a person became violent, we look for evidence that violence was always waiting to emerge. That is why retrospective accounts can be misleading. Every strange childhood behavior begins to look like a warning. Every social difficulty becomes significant. Every act of aggression appears to point toward the future. But life does not provide such certainty. The vast majority of children who experience psychological or behavioral difficulties do not become murderers. That makes the Woodcock case more disturbing, not less. It forces us to ask how a person can move from being a troubled child to committing acts of lethal violence. There is no single answer. Human behavior is shaped by many factors: family environment, personality, psychological development, social relationships, impulse control, exposure to violence, opportunity, individual choices, and circumstances that may never be fully understood. In Woodcock's case, later assessments would focus heavily on his psychological condition and behavior. But psychology can describe patterns. It cannot reverse events. It can help explain behavior. It cannot make the consequences disappear. That distinction would become important as the case moved forward. The institutions of the 1950s were also operating within their own limitations. Modern audiences often imagine that officials in the past possessed the same knowledge and tools available today. They did not. Psychiatric diagnosis was different. Treatment approaches were different. Ideas about childhood development were different. The understanding of violent behavior was different. Risk assessment as a specialized discipline was far less developed. Even the language used to describe troubled young people was different. A teenager like Woodcock could therefore be viewed through several overlapping lenses. He could be seen as a delinquent, a disturbed child, a juvenile offender, a psychiatric patient, a dangerous person, a person capable of rehabilitation. Each label emphasized something different, and each carried different consequences. That ambiguity became more dangerous after the first murder. Before 1956, Woodcock was a troubled teenager. After 1956, he was a murderer. The change was not merely legal. It was conceptual. The people responsible for him could no longer ask only what was wrong with his behavior. They had to ask what he was capable of doing. And that is a much harder question. Behavior can be observed. Capacity is more difficult. A person may behave calmly today and still have the capacity for violence tomorrow. A person may be aggressive in one environment and controlled in another. A person may respond to authority while remaining dangerous without it. That is why institutional confinement creates a complicated problem. If someone behaves well inside a highly controlled environment, what exactly has been demonstrated? Perhaps the person has genuinely changed. Perhaps the environment is successfully controlling him. Perhaps both are true. Or perhaps neither can be known with certainty. Woodcock's case would eventually force authorities to confront that uncertainty repeatedly. But the first test came immediately after the killing of John Dick. John was 7. The significance of his age cannot be overstated. A 7-year-old depends on adults in ways that a teenager does not. Children are taught to trust adults. They are taught that grown people know more about danger. They are taught rules about where they can go and who they should listen to. The killing of a child, therefore, strikes at something deeper than the loss of one life. It violates the assumption that childhood is protected. And when the person responsible is also a teenager, the moral and legal categories become complicated. The offender is young. The victim is younger. Both are children in the broadest sense, but their positions are radically different. One had become capable of killing. The other had no meaningful ability to defend himself against a person who approached him. The system had to respond to that contradiction. Woodcock was arrested and placed within juvenile custody. That response reflected the philosophy of the era. But it also created an extraordinary challenge. How do you rehabilitate someone who has committed an irreversible act? The concept of rehabilitation is built on the possibility of change. It assumes that behavior can be altered, that patterns can be broken, that a young person can learn to make different choices. But rehabilitation becomes more difficult when an offender has already demonstrated extreme violence. The stakes are higher, the margin for error becomes smaller, and the consequences of misjudgment become permanent. Then came Robert May, 15 years old. His death in 1957 occurred while Woodcock was already under institutional control. That fact is central to the historical setting of the case. It tells us that the problem was no longer simply the absence of supervision. The authorities had already intervened. The system had already recognized Woodcock as dangerous enough to require confinement. And still, another young person died. The question becomes almost unavoidable. What had the institution failed to understand? Was there inadequate supervision? Was Woodcock's behavior underestimated? Were the structures in place insufficient? Was his psychological condition misunderstood? Or was the problem deeper than any single failure? It is possible for several things to be true at once. An institution can have rules and still fail to enforce them effectively. Professionals can act in good faith and still reach the wrong conclusion. A person can appear manageable under one set of circumstances and become dangerous under another. That complexity matters because the easiest explanation is rarely the most accurate. The second killing did not simply add another victim. It changed the meaning of the first. John Dick's death could no longer be viewed as an isolated event. There was now evidence of repeated lethal violence. And because Woodcock was still young, the system faced an even more difficult question. Was this a pattern that would continue into adulthood? The answer would come 2 years later. Leslie Mahaffey was 15 when she was killed in 1959. Woodcock was still under institutional control. 3 young victims had now become part of the same criminal history. The names were different. The circumstances were different. But the underlying problem was becoming clearer. Whatever had driven Woodcock's earlier behavior had not simply disappeared after his arrest. The system had attempted to contain him. Yet violence had continued. At this point, the question of punishment could no longer stand alone. The authorities had to consider long-term containment. They had to consider mental health. They had to consider whether Woodcock could ever safely live outside an institution. And they had to consider what would happen if he could not. This is where the physical setting of the case changes. The streets of Toronto are no longer the only important locations. Institutions become part of the geography. Locked doors, controlled movement, staff supervision, psychiatric observation, long periods of confinement. The world of Peter Woodcock increasingly became an institutional world. For the next several decades, his life would be shaped by that environment. Outside, time moved forward. Inside, time was measured differently. A young man could spend years in the same system, while the society beyond the walls changed around him. The longer confinement lasted, the more difficult it became to imagine what a normal life outside would even look like. And this created another paradox. If someone spends most of his adult life in custody, then the behavior observed there may tell us more about his ability to function under institutional rules than about his ability to function freely. That distinction would become central to future assessments. A person can learn the rules of confinement. He can learn how to behave around staff. He can become accustomed to routine. He can grow older. But whether he can live independently without returning to old patterns is another question. For Woodcock, that question will remain unanswered for an extraordinary length of time. The city around him would eventually become almost unrecognizable. The Toronto of his youth would disappear into history. The people who remembered the original crimes would age. Some would die. New generations would know the case only through records. But the victims would remain fixed in the same years. This is the cruelest kind of permanence. For most human beings, memory is accompanied by change. A childhood friend grows older. A photograph becomes outdated. A parent's face changes. A familiar neighborhood is rebuilt. But a dead child does not change. The memory remains tied to a particular age. John Dick would always be 7. Robert May would always be 15. Leslie Mahaffey would always be 15. Their families, however, had to continue aging. They had to live through birthdays that their children would never reach. They had to experience the passing of years without the person who should have been there. The criminal justice system could process Woodcock's case through procedures and institutions. But families do not experience grief procedurally. Grief is not a file. It does not close when the paperwork is completed. It changes shape, perhaps. It becomes quieter. It becomes something carried rather than constantly spoken about. But the absence remains. That is why any serious account of Peter Woodcock must resist the temptation to make the killer the only human being in the story. The psychological complexity of Woodcock is relevant. His childhood is relevant. His institutional history is relevant. His psychiatric assessments are relevant. But none of those things should push the victims to the margins. The reason the system cared about whether Woodcock was dangerous was because other human beings could be harmed. The reason his rehabilitation mattered was because society had to decide whether he could ever safely coexist with other people. And the reason his crimes remained significant decades later was because the people he killed could never return to society. That is the moral landscape surrounding the case. It is also why the 1950s setting matters. The world was different. The institutions were different. The understanding of young offenders was different. But the basic vulnerability of children was not. A 7-year-old was still a 7-year-old. A 15-year-old was still 15. The capacity of a family to love a child was no different. And the devastation caused by losing that child was no less permanent. The Woodcock case would eventually stretch far beyond the boundaries of the decade in which it began. But its roots remained in this environment. A growing Canadian city. A juvenile justice system that believed in the possibility of reform. A troubled teenager whose behavior had become increasingly alarming. And a society that had not yet discovered how long the consequences would last. The first killing created the case. The second transformed it. The third made it impossible to dismiss. Everything after that would be an attempt to understand what had happened and what should be done next. But before we enter the lives of the victims, it is worth remembering one final truth about the setting. There was nothing inevitable about the ordinary world surrounding these events. The city was not waiting for tragedy. The people were not waiting for a killer. Families were living their lives without knowing that 3 young people would soon become part of one of Canada's most troubling criminal histories. That is how most tragedies begin, not with a warning written across the sky, not with a soundtrack announcing what is coming, but quietly, ordinarily, with people going about their lives. And somewhere within that ordinary world, a chain of events begins that no one understands until it is already too late. For John Dick, that chain of events ended when he was 7. For Robert May, it ended when he was 15. For Leslie Mahaffey, it ended at the same age. For Peter Woodcock, however, the chain continued for more than 50 years. The city changed. The institutions changed. He changed, but the consequences remained. And now, to understand what was truly lost, we have to leave the offender behind once again. We have to look at the young lives that existed before the crime. Because before John, Robert, and Leslie became names attached to a murderer, they were simply themselves. And that is the part of the story that should never be forgotten. Before a victim becomes a name in a criminal case, there's a life that exists completely outside the crime. That life is usually ordinary. And that is precisely what makes the law so difficult to comprehend. Criminal investigations tend to reduce human beings into categories: victim, suspect, witness, evidence, date, location, cause of death. Those categories are necessary for the machinery of justice, but they are not enough to describe a human life. A child is more than the age recorded in a report. A teenager is more than a name printed beneath a headline. A family is more than the people waiting for answers from investigators. This is particularly important in the story of Peter Woodcock, because so much attention would eventually be directed toward the person responsible for the killings. His childhood would be examined. His psychological state would be studied. His behavior inside institutions would be observed. His potential for rehabilitation would be debated. But before all of that, there were young people living their lives. They were not characters waiting to enter a murder case. They were simply people who had no reason to believe that their lives would become part of one. That distinction changes the way we should look at the Toronto of the 1950s. It is easy to see an old city through the lens of what happened there. Once we know the ending, ordinary places begin to feel ominous. A street where children once walked becomes a place associated with danger. A neighborhood becomes part of a crime map. An institution becomes a symbol of failure. A date becomes a dividing line between before and after. But the people living through those days did not have the benefit of hindsight. They did not know what the future would reveal. They did not know that the name Peter Woodcock would remain connected to those years for decades. They did not know that his case would eventually become a question about psychiatric confinement and rehabilitation that outlived the generation in which the crimes occurred. They were simply living in Toronto, and Toronto was changing rapidly. The city was becoming increasingly urban and interconnected. Population growth was transforming communities, and post-war Canada was entering a period in which expectations about family life, work, and prosperity were evolving. Yet beneath the image of stability, there were institutions dealing with problems that were much harder to solve. Mental illness was often poorly understood. Children with serious behavioral problems could move through schools, families, and juvenile institutions without receiving the kind of specialized assessment that would be expected today. The boundaries between delinquency, psychological disturbance, and criminal behavior were not always clearly defined. A young person could be regarded as difficult without anyone knowing exactly why. And when that young person became violent, the system was forced to respond after the warning signs had already become consequences. Peter Woodcock belonged to that difficult world. His early behavior had raised concerns. He struggled socially. He displayed disturbing behavior. There were psychological and behavioral issues that would later become important when his life was examined in retrospect. But the system did not have a crystal ball. Neither did his family. Neither did the people who encountered him. That is one of the most important lessons in understanding criminal behavior. Hindsight creates an illusion of inevitability. Once we know that someone became a murderer, everything that happened beforehand can appear to point toward that outcome. But life does not work backward. People make decisions based on what they know at the time. A behavior that looks like a warning after murder may have seemed ambiguous before it. A troubling personality trait may have seemed manageable. An act of aggression may have been treated as an isolated incident, and an adolescent who appeared deeply disturbed might still have been viewed as someone capable of rehabilitation. The belief in rehabilitation was not necessarily naive. It came from a basic understanding of human development. Teenagers are not finished adults. Their identities are still forming. Their judgment is still developing. Their capacity for self-control can change. Their environment can influence their behavior. For many young offenders, intervention can make a profound difference. The problem is that not every case follows the expected path. Peter Woodcock would become one of the cases that challenged the confidence behind that belief. After the killing of John Dick, the system did what it was designed to do. Woodcock was taken into custody. He was removed from the ordinary community. He entered an environment where his behavior could be controlled and examined. But the second killing demonstrated that removal from society did not automatically mean that the underlying danger had been resolved. This is an important distinction. Confinement can stop a person from moving freely. It cannot by itself explain why the person became violent. It cannot necessarily change personality. It cannot guarantee psychological rehabilitation. And it cannot eliminate the possibility that a person will find a way to hurt someone even within an institution. Robert May's death, therefore, became more than another crime in a list. It became evidence that the problem had entered the institution itself. The very place intended to control Woodcock had become part of the history of his violence. That would have profound implications for everything that followed. If the ordinary community could not safely contain him, perhaps a specialized institution was necessary. If a juvenile institution could not safely contain him, perhaps more restrictive supervision was necessary. If psychiatric problems contributed to his behavior, perhaps treatment was necessary. But each proposed solution created another question. What if the solution failed? That question would become the shadow over Woodcock's entire institutional history. It is also where the case becomes less about a single criminal event and more about the architecture of public safety. Society builds institutions because it cannot rely entirely on individual judgment. There are rules, procedures, locks, schedules, staff, medical professionals, correctional officers, courts, review boards. Each is supposed to contribute to a larger system of protection. But systems are created and operated by people. People can make mistakes. They can misunderstand. They can underestimate. They can overestimate. They can disagree. And they can change their minds as new evidence appears. Peter Woodcock's life would eventually be shaped by that process of repeated assessment. He would not simply receive one judgment and disappear into a prison for the rest of his life. His status, his behavior, and his potential for rehabilitation would continue to be relevant. That is one of the reasons his story extended so far beyond the original murders. The question of what to do with him never became completely simple. Punishment has a beginning and an end. Risk assessment is different. Risk is always about the future, and the future keeps moving. A 17-year-old is not the same as a 27-year-old. A 27-year-old is not the same as a 47-year-old. A 47-year-old is not the same as an elderly man. Physical ability changes. Psychological patterns may change. Life experience accumulates. Motivations can change. Behavior can change. But the history remains. The challenge is determining how much weight to give each part. That challenge becomes even more difficult when the original crimes involve young victims. For the people responsible for public safety, the question may be whether the likelihood of future violence has decreased. For the families, the question is different. Their child is already gone. There's no probability attached to that. There's only certainty. The certainty that a life was taken. The certainty that childhood ended too soon. The certainty that every year afterward would be a year in which the child should have been alive. That is why the victims cannot be treated simply as evidence in the story of Woodcock. Their absence became part of the environment in which every later decision was made. The past stood behind the future. Every discussion about rehabilitation existed against the memory of the victims. Every argument about release existed against the possibility of another family experiencing the same kind of loss. And every decision to keep Woodcock confined carried another implication. Perhaps rehabilitation had limits. Perhaps some histories were too dangerous to risk. Perhaps public safety had to outweigh the possibility of freedom. But even that conclusion would raise philosophical questions. If a person is confined for decades, can society still call that rehabilitation? If the person grows old in custody, does age change the meaning of the sentence? If someone has spent most of his life under institutional control, what does freedom even mean when the outside world has become almost entirely unfamiliar? These questions would become increasingly relevant as Woodcock's life continued, but they all began with the original assumption that a young person could change. That assumption is important because it prevents the story from becoming a simple tale of punishment. The authorities were not dealing with a fully formed adult criminal whose identity was already fixed. They were dealing with someone who had committed murder while still very young. That meant there was an argument for intervention, but the subsequent killings made the stakes extraordinarily high. A second chance of the offender could mean another chance for violence. A permanent restriction could mean abandoning the belief that people can change. The dilemma was not theoretical. It was attached to real lives. This is why the setting of the Woodcock case must include more than the streets of Toronto. It must include the institutions of the era. The juvenile justice system, the correctional environment, the developing field of psychiatric treatment, the assumptions surrounding childhood, the expectations placed on families, and the changing understanding of dangerousness. All of these formed the world in which decisions about Woodcock were made, and all of them were imperfect. There is another factor that becomes important when telling an old case: memory. The further we move from the original events, the easier it becomes for the details to become simplified. A complex teenager becomes a monster. A complicated institution becomes a villain. A family becomes a quote in a newspaper. A victim becomes a number. A decades-long debate becomes a single sentence. But reality is usually more complicated. There may have been people who genuinely believed Woodcock could change. There may have been professionals who sincerely believed treatment was working. There may have been people who believed the opposite. There may have been disagreements that never produced a clear answer. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Because if everyone had known exactly what would happen, there would have been no dilemma. The tragedy is that they did not know. They had to make decisions under uncertainty. And some of those decisions had consequences that could not be reversed. The case also demonstrates why psychological analysis should be handled carefully. It is tempted to search for a diagnosis and use it as an explanation for everything. But mental illness is not synonymous with violence. Psychological disturbance does not automatically produce murder. Millions of people live with serious psychological difficulties without ever harming another person. When examining Woodcock, the relevant question is not whether psychological problems existed in isolation. The relevant question is how his particular behavioral and psychological history interacted with his actions, his environment, and his capacity for violence. That is a much more difficult question. It requires nuance. It also requires restraint. The fact that someone has a psychological disorder does not remove responsibility for the harm they cause. At the same time, understanding the psychological factors surrounding violence can be essential to preventing future violence. Those two ideas can exist together. Accountability and understanding are not opposites. They are both necessary. The same is true of compassion. Compassion for a troubled offender does not require abandoning the victims. Concern for rehabilitation does not require forgetting the dead. Public safety does not require pretending that people are incapable of change. The tension between these ideas will become the central theme of Woodcock's later life. But in the late 1950s, that future was still unfolding. The murders were recent. The institutions were still responding. The public was still trying to understand how someone so young could be connected to such terrible violence. And somewhere inside that system was a teenager whose future had become almost impossible to separate from his past. The rest of his life would be measured against what he had already done. That is an extraordinary burden for any human being to carry, because society had to decide whether the person who committed those crimes could ever safely become something else. The answer would not come quickly. It would take years, then decades. Woodcock would grow older. The institutions would change. The people evaluating him would change. The world outside would change. But the original victims would remain frozen in memory. And that is where the setting finally gives way to the human heart of the story. Before we ask what Peter Woodcock became, we must ask who the victims were. Before we study the offender's mind, we must remember the lives that existed independently of it. Before we examine institutions, we must remember why those institutions mattered. There was a 7-year-old boy whose life should have continued. There were teenagers whose futures should have extended far beyond the years in which they died. There were families who expected ordinary life and instead received grief. And there was a 17-year-old whose actions would create consequences that lasted longer than anyone could have imagined. The city continued. The country continued. History continued. But for those families, time had been divided permanently into two worlds: before and after. That division is the true setting of the Peter Woodcock story. Everything that follows happens on the other side of it. Before John Dick became a name in the history of Peter Woodcock, he was simply a 7-year-old boy. That distinction is easy to lose. In the years that followed his death, John's name would appear in the context of a murder investigation, a juvenile offender, and a case that would eventually stretch across more than half a century. His death would become the first known killing associated with Peter Woodcock. But John did not enter the world as a victim. He entered it as a child, 7 years old, an age when life is still measured in small distances. Home to school, school to home, the familiar street, the familiar faces, the familiar routines that give childhood its sense of security. At 7, a person is only beginning to understand how large the world really is. Adults seem powerful. Older children seem confident. The future feels almost impossibly long because there is so much of it still ahead. 7 years is hardly enough time to understand what a lifetime means. And yet, that was all the time John Dick was given. The record surrounding his death inevitably focus on the final chapter of his life. That is what criminal investigations do. They ask where a person was, who they were with, what happened, who was responsible, what evidence remained. Those questions are necessary, but they can also create a strange distortion. The final day becomes larger than the years that came before it. The death becomes more visible than the life. The crime becomes more remembered than the child. That is why John's age matters. It reminds us that the person at the center of the first tragedy was not a case. He was a child whose future had not yet been written. There were countless things he had not yet experienced. He had not reached adolescence. He had not reached adulthood. He had not discovered what kind of person he would become. He had not lived through the ordinary changes that most people take for granted because they happen so gradually that we rarely notice them. A child becomes a teenager. A teenager becomes an adult. An adult builds a life. Years accumulate almost invisibly. John never had those years. His story stopped at 7. And because the available information about his private life is limited, there is a temptation to fill the empty spaces with imagination, to invent a personality, to imagine his favorite activities, to describe conversations that were never recorded, to create details about his family that may sound believable but cannot be verified. But doing that would create another kind of distortion. The respectful way to tell John's story is not to manufacture a life for him. It is to acknowledge the life that we know existed and the enormous future that was taken from it. John Dick was 7 years old when he was killed in Toronto in 1956. The person responsible was 17-year-old Peter Woodcock. That 10-year difference creates a painful contrast. Both were young, but only one possessed the power to make the decision that ended the other's life. Woodcock approached John and took him to an isolated area. John was killed. The simplicity of those facts is almost unbearable. There is no need for invented dialogue, no need for imagined final words, no need to construct a dramatic scene that the historical record cannot support. The reality is already devastating. A child was taken away from the ordinary world, and he did not return alive. For the people who knew John, that fact would have changed everything. A child does not exist alone. A 7-year-old belongs to a network of relationships, parents, relatives, friends, teachers, neighbors, people who expect to see him again, people who know his face, people who know his voice, people who know the small details that never appear in police reports. Those details are often the first things lost when a person becomes part of a criminal case. Investigators record the facts necessary to understand the crime. History preserves the facts necessary to understand the case. But neither can always preserve the ordinary texture of a child's existence. The simple things. A morning, a meal, a school day, a family routine, a laugh, a question, a moment of frustration, a moment of happiness. Those things rarely become evidence, and yet they are what make up a life. John's death therefore created a silence that extended far beyond the location where he was killed. His family had to continue living in a world from which he had suddenly disappeared. The future that had once been assumed became impossible. There would be no gradual transition from childhood into adolescence, no teenage years, no adult life, no opportunity to look back and remember what John had been like as a 7-year-old while knowing what he had later become. He would remain 7 forever. That is one of the cruelest features of childhood death. The child remains young in memory while everyone around him grows older. Parents age, siblings age, friends age. The world changes, but the child's image remains fixed. And in John's case, that fixed image would become connected to a 17-year-old offender whose own life was only beginning. Peter Woodcock was 10 years older than John. That difference may not sound enormous when comparing adults. Between a 30-year-old and a 40-year-old, 10 years can seem almost insignificant. Between 7 and 17, it is enormous. A 7-year-old depends on adults for protection. A 17-year-old is approaching adulthood and has far greater physical and psychological capacity. The imbalance was profound, and the fact that Woodcock was himself still young would later complicate the response of the justice system. He was a murderer, but he was also a juvenile. The system had to hold both realities at once. That is difficult even in theory. In practice, it became one of the most consequential challenges of the case. John's death was the point where those competing principles collided. There was the undeniable need for justice. There was the need to protect the public. And there was the belief that young offenders could sometimes be rehabilitated. Those principles did not necessarily contradict one another. But John's family did not have the luxury of thinking about the case only in philosophical terms. For them, the most immediate fact was much simpler. John was gone. The arrest of Woodcock could not change that. His confinement could not change it. A court decision could not change it. Any future rehabilitation could not change it. The death was permanent. That permanence is important because it separates the experience of the victim from the experience of the offender. Woodcock would have a future. He would grow older. He would receive assessments. He would live through decades. His psychological state could change. His behavior could change. His understanding of himself could change. John would have none of those possibilities. His future had been removed completely. The story could have ended there. One child killed. One young offender arrested. One case entering the justice system. But it did not. The death of John Dick became the beginning of a pattern. Approximately a year later, another young person would die. Robert May was 15. His age immediately changes the emotional landscape. 15 is still young, but it is no longer early childhood. A 15-year-old is beginning to occupy the border between adolescence and adulthood. There's more independence, more awareness of the world, more personal identity, more dreams that begin to take shape. But 15 is still far from old. There should have been years ahead. Education, friendships, decisions, mistakes, achievements. The gradual process of becoming an adult. Robert never reached it. His life ended before adulthood, just as John's did. But there was another devastating element to Robert's death. By the time it happened in 1957, Peter Woodcock was already in custody. The system already knew that Woodcock had killed. The authorities already understood that he posed an extraordinary challenge. Yet another teenager became a victim. This transformed the story. John's death was a tragedy. Robert's death demonstrated repetition. The distinction matters. A single act of violence can sometimes be interpreted as an isolated event. Repeated violence suggests something deeper. It raises questions about motive, impulse, psychological disturbance, and the ability of institutions to control behavior. And because Robert was killed while Woodcock was under institutional control, the case became a direct challenge to the idea that custody alone could protect others. Robert's life should be remembered independently of that institutional failure. He was not important merely because his death proved something about Woodcock. He was important because he was a human being who died. The fact that he was 15 tells us how much remained ahead of him. 15 is an age of unfinished possibilities. A person at 15 is still becoming. There are still years in which personality develops, relationships deepen, and ambitions change. Someone who is 15 may not yet know what profession they want. They may not know where they will live. They may not know whom they will love. They may not know what kind of adult they will become. Robert never had the chance to discover any of it. His future disappeared with him. And then came Leslie Mahaffey, 15 years old, the third known victim connected to Woodcock. Her death occurred in 1959, while Woodcock remained within institutional control. By then, the story had become impossible to describe as a single tragedy. There were now 3 young lives: a child, a teenage boy, a teenage girl, 3 different people, 3 different histories, 3 futures that had been interrupted, and one offender whose life would continue for more than half a century. Leslie's place in the story deserves the same care as John's and Robert's. She should not exist only as the third name in a list. She was 15. She had reached an age at which childhood was beginning to give way to adolescence and adulthood. She should have had time to grow into that transition. She should have had the chance to make mistakes that were not fatal. She should have had the opportunity to discover who she would become. But that future never arrived. When people hear about a series of murders, there is often a tendency to search for similarities between victims. Investigators naturally do this because patterns can help identify how crimes occurred and who might be responsible. But human beings do not become interchangeable simply because they appear together in an investigative pattern. John was not Robert. Robert was not Leslie. Their ages may have overlapped. Their deaths may have become connected by one criminal history. But each was an individual. That distinction is essential. A victim-centered account should resist the idea that their main purpose and story is to help explain the offender. Their lives mattered independently. The fact that they became connected to Peter Woodcock was an accident of violence, not the defining purpose of their existence. This is particularly important because the offender's biography is so extensive. Woodcock lived for decades after the killings. There are years of institutional history to examine, psychological evaluations, questions of rehabilitation, questions of release, questions of risk. His life generates an enormous amount of material. The victims cannot compete with that volume of information because their lives were cut short. That imbalance itself is part of the tragedy. The killer can accumulate decades of history. The victims cannot. The killer can be reassessed. The victims cannot. The killer can be discussed by psychologists. The victims cannot speak for themselves. The killer can become old. The victims remain the age at which they died. This is why the names must remain present throughout the story. John Dick, 7 years old. Robert May, 15 years old. Leslie Mahaffey, 15 years old. The numbers are not merely details. They tell us how much life was left, and they tell us what the murders actually destroyed. It is possible to become fascinated by the psychological complexity of Peter Woodcock, his early behavior, his institutional history, his psychiatric condition, his apparent changes over time, the possibility of rehabilitation, the possibility of release. Those questions are legitimate, but they must never become more important than the people whose lives created the questions in the first place. Without John, there would be no Woodcock case as we know it. Without Robert, the story would have been different. Without Leslie, it would have been different again. Their deaths created the moral stakes. They transformed a troubled teenager into a long-term public safety problem. They forced institutions to confront the limits of their methods. They made rehabilitation a question with consequences far beyond the offender. And they left families carrying a form of grief that no institution could resolve. There's another reason the victims matter. They remind us that crime does not only happen to people. It happens to relationships. When a child dies, the loss spreads through a family. When a teenager dies, the people who expected to see that teenager grow older are forced to continue without them. A murder can therefore be understood as an attack on an entire network of human connections. The victim disappears, but the absence remains. The people around them must learn how to live with it. That is something a criminal sentence cannot measure. A sentence can be counted in years. Grief cannot. The years after a death do not simply add up. They accumulate in memories. Birthdays that become reminders. Family events where one person is missing. Photographs that never change. Questions that can never be answered. A child who should become an adult remains forever young in the memories of those who loved him. That is the hidden timeline of the case. The official timeline moves from 1956 to 1957 to 1959, and then onward through decades of confinement. The family timeline is different. It begins before the crime. Then comes the loss. Then the years after. And every year contains the same absence. For John, the story stopped at 7. For Robert and Leslie, it stopped at 15. For Woodcock, the story continued. That contrast will remain at the heart of everything that follows. Because the next stage of the case is not simply about how Peter Woodcock killed. It is about what happened when the system tried to understand and control him. But before entering that world, It is important to remember what was being protected, not statistics, not abstract concepts, not merely public safety. People, young people, lives that should have continued. The story of Peter Woodcock begins with a murderer, but it should never end with him. It should end with the understanding that every criminal case is built around a human cost. In this case, that cost had 3 names: John Dick, Robert May, Leslie Mahaffey. A 7-year-old boy, 2 15-year-olds, 3 lives that ended before adulthood, and 3 families who were forced to continue living in a world that no longer contained the people they had expected to grow old with. The rest of the story will examine Peter Woodcock, but these names must come first, because before he became the subject of psychiatric assessments, institutional debates, and decades of confinement, he was simply a teenager who crossed paths with 3 young lives. And after he was gone, after the institutions closed their records, and after the years of history had passed, the final truth remained unchanged. The victims did not get those years back. They never got another morning. They never got another birthday. They never got the chance to become the adults they might have been. Peter Woodcock did. That is the difference between the offender's timeline and the victim's timeline. And it is the reason their stories must never be reduced to the moments when their lives ended